This is the story of a World War II soldier whose shadow saved hundreds of lives by moving on its own. It warned him of ambushes, pointed out hidden enemies, guided him through impossible battles. But why was his shadow protecting him? How did it know danger was coming? And what does his dying 8-year-old brother back home have to do with it? The answer will shock you, but you'll only find out if you listen to this entire story. So, let's start. Picture this. You're 19 years old. You've never been more than 50 miles from your hometown in Ohio, and now you're crouched in a muddy foxhole somewhere in France, with German artillery shells screaming overhead like banshees from hell. This was Private James Morrison's reality in the winter of 1944. James had volunteered the day after Pearl Harbor, not because he was brave, not because he was a hero, but because his little brother Tommy had looked at him with those wide, trusting eyes and said, "Jimmy, you're gonna go fight the bad guys, right?" Sometimes the weight of a child's faith can push a man toward destiny. 3 years later, James found himself with the 101st Airborne, part of the push through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge was raging, and every day felt like borrowed time. His squad had been pinned down for 2 days now, surviving on frozen K rations and melted snow. The cold wasn't just in the air. It had settled into their bones, their souls. But something strange had been happening to James. Something he couldn't explain to his buddies without sounding like he'd lost his mind to shell shock. It started 3 weeks earlier, during a routine patrol near Bastogne. The morning sun was cutting through the trees at a sharp angle, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. James was walking point, his rifle ready, when he glanced down at his shadow stretching ahead of him. That's when he saw it. His shadow's hands weren't holding a rifle. James stopped dead in his tracks. He looked down at his own hands gripping his M1 Garand, then back at his shadow. The shadow's arms were extended, palms out, as if pushing against something invisible. James moved his rifle from side to side. His actual shadow followed every movement, but for just that moment, for just that heartbeat, he could have sworn his shadow had been doing something completely different. "Morrison, what's the holdup?" Sergeant Martinez called from behind. James shook his head, convinced the stress was getting to him. "Nothing, Sarge. Thought I saw something." But he hadn't seen something. He had seen nothing. And sometimes nothing can be more terrifying than something. The incidents became more frequent. During a firefight outside a bombed village, James dove for cover behind a stone wall. As he rolled, he caught a glimpse of his shadow on the ground. While James was falling backward, his shadow appeared to be pushing forward, arms outstretched. A split second later, a sniper's bullet whistled through the exact spot where James would have been if he hadn't thrown himself backward. Coincidence, he told himself. Just coincidence. Then there was the night ambush. James was on watch duty when he noticed his shadow cast by the flickering light of a distant burning farmhouse pointing steadily toward a cluster of trees 50 yards away. James squinted into the darkness, but saw nothing. His shadow kept pointing. Against all logic, James quietly woke Sergeant Martinez and whispered about movement in those trees. Martinez looked at him like he was crazy, but called for flares anyway. When the white light bloomed across the battlefield, it revealed 6 German soldiers creeping toward their position. "How the hell did you see them in the dark, Morrison?" asked Martinez later. James couldn't answer, because he hadn't seen them. His shadow had. Now, huddled in this foxhole, with shells falling like deadly rain, James watched his shadow dancing on the muddy wall. The explosions created strobing light, making shadows jump and twist. But James's shadow wasn't just moving with the light, it was moving with purpose. As another artillery shell screamed overhead, James's shadow suddenly flattened against the foxhole wall, arms spread wide, as if shielding something. James felt an overwhelming urge to press himself against that same wall. He didn't question it anymore. He just moved. The shell impacted 20 feet away, sending shrapnel singing through the air exactly where James had been crouching moments before. Private Danny Kowalski, sharing the foxhole, stared at James with wide eyes. "How did you know to move?" James looked at his shadow, now calm and normal on the wall. "I don't know, Danny. I really don't know." But deep down, James was beginning to understand something impossible, something that would either save his life or drive him completely mad. His shadow wasn't just following him anymore. It was protecting him.
Part 2. First Signs of Protection. The next morning brought an eerie silence to the battlefield. Sometimes silence is more terrifying than the loudest artillery barrage, because silence means the enemy is planning something. James crawled out of his foxhole, his joints stiff from the cold and fear. The snow crunched under his boots as he surveyed the devastation around them. Sergeant Martinez gathered the remaining men of their squad. Out of 12 soldiers who had started this mission, only 7 remained. War has a way of making mathematics cruel. "We're moving out in 10 minutes, Martinez announced, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "Intelligence says there's a German supply depot 2 clicks northeast. We take it, we might actually have ammunition that isn't frozen solid." As they prepared to move, James noticed something that made his blood run colder than the Belgian winter. His shadow, cast by the pale morning sun, was pointing in a completely different direction than Martinez had indicated. While Martinez pointed northeast, James's shadow stretched northwest toward a dense patch of forest that looked innocent enough. James had learned to trust his shadow. But how do you tell your commanding officer that your shadow disagrees with military intelligence? You don't. You follow orders and hope your shadow is wrong. They moved in single file through the snow-covered terrain, James taking his usual position as point man. Every step felt like walking through a graveyard. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind. Even their footsteps seemed muffled by something heavier than snow. 20 minutes into their march, James's shadow began behaving strangely again. Instead of following his movements naturally, it kept veering left as if trying to pull him toward a different path. James found himself unconsciously drifting in that direction until Corporal Williams grabbed his arm. "Morrison, where the hell are you going? The depot is that way." James looked down at his shadow, now normal and obedient. "Sorry, Corp, thought I saw tracks." But he hadn't seen tracks. His shadow had been trying to lead him away from something, and James was beginning to understand that when your shadow tries to save your life, you should probably listen. They continued toward the supposed supply depot. The forest grew thicker, the shadows deeper. James's unease multiplied with every step. His shadow kept twitching, kept pointing away from their destination. It was like having a guardian angel that could only communicate through silhouettes. Then James heard it, the faintest sound that didn't belong, a metallic click, almost like someone chambering around, but softer, more careful. James's shadow immediately flattened against the snow, arms spread wide. Without thinking, James dropped flat and screamed, "Ambush!" The forest exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes erupted from hidden positions as German soldiers opened fire from concealed bunkers. The abandoned supply depot was a trap, and James's squad had walked right into it, almost. Because James had dropped first, his warning gave the others precious seconds to find cover. Precious seconds that meant the difference between life and death in combat. They scrambled behind fallen logs and into shell craters as bullets whined overhead. "How did you know?" Martinez shouted over the gunfire. James couldn't explain that his shadow had warned him. Instead, he just pointed to his ear. "Heard something, Sarge!" The firefight lasted lasted 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. James found himself pressed against a fallen tree, returning fire whenever he could spot a muzzle flash. During one particularly intense exchange, something incredible happened. A German soldier had flanked around to James's right, approaching through the thick underbrush. James was focused on targets straight ahead and didn't see the threat, but his shadow did. Even though James was facing forward, his shadow on the snow beside him was turned 90 degrees to the right, one arm extended as if pointing at the enemy approaching. James felt an inexplicable urge to look right. When he did, he saw the German soldier raising his rifle not 20 feet away. James spun and fired in one smooth motion. The enemy soldier dropped, his shot going wild into the trees. Another life saved by an impossible shadow. When the battle finally ended, 3 more of their squad had been wounded, but none killed. It was a miracle, considering they'd walked into a perfectly planned ambush. As they regrouped and tended to their wounded, James noticed something that made his hands shake. The ground where they would have been standing when the ambush began was torn apart by machine gun fire. Perfect intersecting fields of fire that would have cut them down like wheat. If James hadn't dropped when he did, if his warning hadn't come those crucial seconds early, none of them would have survived. Private Kowalski limped over to James, blood seeping through a bandage on his leg. "Morrison, I don't know how you heard them coming, but you saved all of our lives." James looked down at his shadow, now perfectly normal in the afternoon light. "Just got lucky, I guess." But luck had nothing to do with it. James was beginning to understand that something or someone was watching over him. His shadow wasn't just following him anymore. It was leading him, guiding him, protecting not just James, but everyone around him. The question that haunted him as they made their way back to base wasn't how this was possible. The question was why. Why him? Why now? And what price would he eventually have to pay for this supernatural protection? As they walked through the snow, James noticed his shadow one more time. For just a moment, it looked like it was holding someone's hand. A smaller hand. A child's hand. James thought about Tommy back home, probably building snow forts and dreaming of his big brother coming home a hero. Maybe that's all the explanation he needed.
Part 3. The Shadow's Warning. Back at base camp, James couldn't sleep, not because of the artillery in the distance or the snores of exhausted soldiers around him. He couldn't sleep because every time he closed his eyes, he saw that moment when his shadow had seemed to hold a child's hand. The image burned in his mind like a photograph exposed to too much light. 3 days had passed since the ambush. 3 days of James watching his shadow with the intensity of a man studying a map to his own survival. The other soldiers had begun to notice his strange behavior. During chow time, James would position himself so he could see his shadow clearly. During briefings, his eyes would dart down to check what his shadow was doing. "Morrison's cracking up," he heard Corporal Williams whisper to Private Jensen. "Seen it before. Good soldiers start acting strange right before they completely lose it." Maybe Williams was right. Maybe James was losing his mind. But if insanity was keeping him and his squad alive, then he'd embrace it completely. The next mission came down from command like a death sentence wrapped in official orders. A German stronghold had been identified in a bombed-out church 5 miles behind enemy lines. Intelligence suggested it was being used as a radio relay station, coordinating attacks against Allied forces. The mission was simple in its impossibility. Get in, destroy the equipment, get out. 12 men would go in. History suggested maybe half would come back. As they prepared their gear, James found himself in front of a cracked mirror in the makeshift barracks. His reflection looked back at him, hollow-eyed and gaunt from weeks of combat rations and constant fear. But it was his shadow in the mirror that caught his attention. Even in the dim lamplight, his shadow seemed more solid than it should be, more present. James raised his right hand. His reflection raised its left hand, as reflections do. But his shadow in the mirror raised both hands, palms out, in what could only be described as a gesture of warning or protection. "You seeing this?" James whispered to his reflection. His reflection nodded back. His shadow shook its head. That night, as they moved through the French countryside under a moonless sky, James' shadow began acting more aggressively than ever before. Instead instead of subtle hints and gentle guidance, it was practically fighting against James's movements. When the squad would move in one direction, James's shadow would strain in another, like a dog pulling against its leash. The abandoned church loomed ahead of them, its Gothic spires silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Half the roof had been blown away by previous bombing runs, and the walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. It looked like the skeleton of some massive beast picked clean by the war. But James's shadow was going absolutely wild. As they approached the church, James's shadow began moving independently of any light source. Even when clouds covered the moon and they were moving in near total darkness, James could sense his shadow thrashing beside him, trying to pull him away from their target. "Hold up," James whispered, grabbing Sergeant Martinez's arm. "What now, Morrison?" I struggled to find words that wouldn't get him court-martialed for mental instability. "Something doesn't feel right about this place, Sarge. My gut's telling me we're walking into something bad." Martinez studied the church through his binoculars. "Intel says there may be 6 Germans in there max. We've got 12 men and the element of surprise." But James's shadow was now doing something he'd never seen before. It was multiplying. In the faint starlight, James could swear he saw not one shadow but dozens, all pointing away from the church, all gesturing frantically for them to retreat. "Sarge, what if intelligence is wrong? What if this isn't a radio station? What if it's something worse?" Martinez lowered his binoculars and looked at James with a mixture of concern and frustration. "Morrison, you've been acting strange for weeks now. The men are starting to talk. Are you fit for duty, or do I need to send you back for evaluation?" James looked at his shadow army, all of them now flat against the ground as if taking cover from incoming fire. The message couldn't be clearer. This place was a death trap. "I'm fit for duty, Sarge, but I'm telling you, something about this mission stinks. Your concerns are noted, Private. Now we move forward." "That's an order." They advanced toward the church in standard formation. James took point, as always, but every step felt like walking toward his own execution. His shadow wasn't just warning him anymore. It was screaming. As they reached the outer wall of the church cemetery, James's shadow suddenly stood up from the ground and began waving its arms frantically. Not pointing, not gesturing, waving, like someone trying to flag down help or warn away approaching danger. That's when James heard it. The sound his shadow had been trying to warn him about for the past hour. Not the whisper of wind through broken stone, not the scurrying of rats through rubble, the mechanical hum of generators, lots of them. This wasn't a small radio relay station with 6 German soldiers. This was a major operations center, and they were walking 12 men into what was probably a fortified position with dozens of defenders. James grabbed Martinez's arm again, more urgently this time. "Sarge, listen, do you hear that humming?" Martinez paused, tilting his head. After a moment, his expression changed from annoyance to concern. "Son of a bitch, that's not 6 guys with a radio." As if summoned by their realization, floodlights suddenly blazed to life around the church. The darkness that had been their protection vanished in an instant. James and his squad found themselves illuminated like actors on a stage, exposed and vulnerable in the cemetery of a fortified German stronghold. "Fall back!" Martinez screamed. But it was too late. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions around the church. The tombstones that had seemed like potential cover now became deadly obstacles as bullets ricocheted off marble and stone. James dove behind a large monument, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. As bullets whined overhead, James looked at his shadow cast by the harsh floodlights. His shadow was no longer waving or warning. It was simply there, solid and calm, one hand extended toward James, as if offering comfort. For the first time since this supernatural protection had begun, James understood something crucial. His shadow hadn't been trying to save his life tonight. It had been trying to save all of their lives, and he had failed to convince his sergeant to listen. Now, pinned down in a cemetery with enemy fire coming from all directions, James realized that sometimes even guardian angels have limits. Sometimes the people you're trying to save have to want to be saved. The question now was whether James's mysterious protection could get any of them out of this alive. Part 4. Battle of the Haunted Forest. Hell has many faces. Tonight, it wore the face of a bombed-out church surrounded by the graves of the innocent dead. Machine
Machine gun fire swept across the cemetery like a deadly scythe, chipping marble angels and shattering stone crosses that had stood for centuries. James pressed himself against a granite tomb, feeling the vibrations of bullets striking stone just inches from his head. "Martinez, how many men do we have left?" James shouted over the chaos. "I count 8. We lost Kowalski and Williams in the first volley." The sergeant's voice was strained, barely audible above the gunfire. 8 men left out of 12, and they were completely surrounded. James looked at his shadow, expecting to see panic or frantic movement. Instead, his shadow was perfectly still, one arm extended toward a gap between 2 large monuments about 30 feet to their left. Even in this chaos, even facing impossible odds, his shadow was still trying to guide him. "Sarge, there's a way out! Follow me! Morrison, you stay put! That's an order!" But James had learned that sometimes following orders meant dying, and sometimes disobeying orders meant living. His shadow had never led him wrong before. Tonight wouldn't be the first time. James broke from cover, sprinting in a crouch toward the gap his shadow had indicated. Immediately, machine gun fire tracked his movement, bullets striking the ground where his feet had been milliseconds before. But something impossible was happening. James's shadow wasn't following him as he ran. It was running ahead of him, mapping out the safest path through the deadly crossfire. When his shadow zigged left, James followed. When it zagged right, he obeyed without question. Bullets that should have found their mark instead found empty air. James reached the gap between monuments and dove through, landing hard on frozen ground beyond. "The rest of you, follow Morrison's path exactly," Martinez commanded. One by one, the remaining 7 soldiers followed James's route. Not all of them made it. Private Jensen took a bullet in the shoulder, but kept moving. Corporal Blake wasn't so lucky. He hesitated for a split second, deviating from the exact path James had taken, and paid for it with his life. 7 soldiers left. They found themselves in a section of the cemetery that sloped down toward a line of trees. The floodlights couldn't penetrate the forest, which meant darkness, and darkness meant James's shadow could work its mysterious magic. "Into the trees! Move, move, move!" Martinez ordered. As they reached the forest edge, James felt the familiar sensation of his shadow taking control. But this time was different. This time, his shadow didn't feel like one entity. It felt like many, as if every soul who had ever died protecting someone else was suddenly standing beside him. The trees were thick enough to provide cover, but sparse enough to allow moonlight to filter through, creating a patchwork of light and shadow across the forest floor. James's shadow began moving in ways that defied every law of physics he'd ever learned. When the moonlight should have cast his shadow behind him, it appeared beside him. When clouds covered the moon entirely, his shadow remained visible, glowing with its own faint luminescence. "Morrison, what's our play?" Martinez asked, breathing heavily. James looked at his shadow, which was pointing deeper into the forest. "We go that way. That way leads further behind enemy lines. We need to get back to our own forces." "Sarge, trust me, please. Just this once. Trust me completely." Martinez studied James's face in the dim moonlight. Maybe he saw something there that convinced him. Maybe he just ran out of better options. "Lead the way, Private, but if you get us all killed, I'm gonna haunt you in the afterlife." They moved through the forest in single file, James leading with his shadow as their guide. The supernatural protection was stronger now, more confident. His shadow would pause at intersections, seeming to listen to sounds only it could hear, then choose the safest path forward. Behind them, they could hear German soldiers spreading out from the church, searching for them with flashlights and dogs. The hunt was on, and they were the prey. But James's shadow seemed to know where every enemy patrol would be before the patrol knew it themselves. 20 minutes into their forest march, James's shadow suddenly flattened against a tree trunk, one arm pointing to their left. James signaled for silence and listened. Sure enough, the sound of German voices drifted through the trees, growing closer. James motioned for his men to take cover behind fallen logs and thick tree trunks. The German patrol passed within 10 feet of their hiding spot, so close that James could smell cigarette smoke and hear one soldier complaining about the cold in hushed German. When the patrol had moved on, James's shadow stood up and continued forward. This happened 3 more times over the next hour. Each time, James's shadow detected a approaching enemies long before human senses could. Each time, it guided them to perfect hiding spots. Each time, they avoided contact. But the most incredible moment came when they reached a clearing deep in the forest. James's shadow suddenly multiplied again, but this time, each shadow took the form of his fallen comrades. I could see Kowalski's distinctive slouch, William's habit of keeping his rifle at port arms, Blake's way of constantly checking his equipment. The shadow squad began moving through the clearing in a tactical formation, pointing out safe paths and warning of dangers. I understood. My fallen brothers were still fighting alongside me, still protecting the living through the mysterious power that had been guiding my shadow. "Do you guys see that?" whispered Private Chen, the youngest member of our group. "See what?" Martinez asked. Chen pointed at the clearing. "The other soldiers moving with us." Martinez squinted into the darkness. "I don't see anything, son." But James saw them, and apparently so did Chen. The shadow soldiers were real, at least to those who needed to see them most. They followed the shadow squad across the clearing and back into the dense forest on the other side. The shadows led them through a maze of trees and undergrowth that seemed impossible to navigate in the darkness, but somehow they never got lost, never made a wrong turn. As dawn began to break through the trees, James realized they had traveled in a wide circle around the German stronghold. His shadow had been leading them not away from their lines, but toward them through the safest possible route. In the growing light ahead, he could see the familiar shape of American helmets and the glint of morning sun off Allied weapons. They had made it home. As they approached their own lines and called out the password, James looked back at his shadow one more time. The shadow soldiers were fading with the growing daylight, but just before they disappeared completely, each one seemed to salute. James returned the salute, tears streaming down his face. He had finally understood the true nature of his protection. It wasn't just his shadow watching over him. It was every soldier who had ever died protecting his brothers in arms, every soul who had chosen sacrifice over survival.
And somehow, James had become their instrument in the world of the living. Part 5. The Ultimate Sacrifice. 2 weeks after the haunted forest, James received a letter that changed everything. The envelope was worn from its long journey across the Atlantic, postmarked from Millfield, Ohio. His mother's familiar handwriting on the front made his hands shake before he even opened it. "Dearest Jimmy," it began, "I pray this letter finds you safe. I have wonderful news and heartbreaking news. The wonderful news is that Tommy talks about you every day, telling everyone in town about his hero brother who's fighting the Nazis. The heartbreaking news is that Tommy has been very sick. The doctors say it's his heart. It's the same condition that took your father. But Tommy is so young, so small." James had to stop reading. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. His little brother, the boy with the trusting eyes who had sent him off to war, was dying, and James was thousands of miles away, unable to do anything but fight in a war that suddenly seemed less important than being home. He looked down at his shadow in the afternoon sun. For the first time since this supernatural protection had begun, his shadow looked sad, diminished, as if it too understood that some battles couldn't be won with mysterious warnings or impossible guidance. "Doctors say Tommy asks for you every day. He keeps saying that his big brother's shadow is protecting him, just like it's protecting you. I don't understand what he means, but he seems so sure of it. He draws pictures of you with 2 shadows, one for you and one for him. Jimmy, I know you can't come home, but if you could write him a letter, it might mean everything." James folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket right next to his heart. That evening, he sat down to write the most difficult letter of his life. But as he picked up his pen, something extraordinary happened. His shadow on the paper wasn't holding a pen. His shadow was holding a small boy's hand. The next morning brought orders that felt like destiny calling. A German armored division was advancing toward a small Belgian town called Riverside, where American medics had established a field hospital. Over 200 wounded Allied soldiers lay helpless in that hospital. too injured to be moved, too important to be abandoned. James's unit was part of a desperate defensive force tasked with holding Riverside until the wounded could be evacuated. It was a suicide mission dressed as a strategic operation. Everyone knew it. Nobody talked about it. As they prepared to move out, James noticed his shadow behaving differently than ever before. Instead of pointing toward safety or warning of danger, his shadow kept reaching toward the east, toward home, toward Ohio, toward a little boy who was dying while his big brother fought strangers in a foreign land. "You feel it too, don't you?" James whispered to his shadow. "Tommy's getting weaker." His shadow nodded, a movement so subtle that anyone watching would have dismissed it as a trick of the light. But James understood. His protection hadn't just been about keeping him alive. It had been about keeping Tommy's faith alive. Every time James survived an impossible situation, somewhere in Ohio, a sick little boy grew a little stronger, knowing his hero brother was still fighting. But faith, like shadows, can only exist where there's light, and Tommy's light was fading. The defense of Riverside began at dawn. German tanks rolled across the Belgian countryside like steel thunderclouds, supported by infantry that seemed to stretch to the horizon. James's unit took positions in the town square, using rubble and abandoned buildings as cover. The first assault came like a hammer blow. German artillery pulverized buildings that had stood for centuries. Machine gun fire swept the streets. James found himself behind an overturned truck with 3 other soldiers, watching his shadow for guidance. But his shadow wasn't focused on the battle. It kept reaching eastward, growing fainter with each passing hour. "Morrison," Sergeant Martinez crawled over during a brief lull in the fighting. "We're falling back to the hospital. We'll make our final stand there." As they retreated through the town, James realized what was happening. Every mile they fell back brought them closer to the field hospital, where 200 wounded men lay helpless. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were sons and brothers and fathers. They were Tommy, multiplied 200 times. The hospital was a converted school building, its windows now covered with sandbags and red crosses painted on every surface. Inside, wounded men lay on stretchers in hallways, their faces pale, but their eyes determined. They knew what was happening outside. They knew their protectors were outnumbered and outgunned. James positioned himself at a second-floor window overlooking the main approach to the hospital. His shadow, cast by the setting sun through the window, seemed to be growing more transparent by the minute, as if it was using up its strength, spending its supernatural protection like ammunition in a final battle. The German assault on the hospital began at darkness. Flares lit up the night sky, turning the battlefield into a hellscape of light and shadow. James fired his rifle until the barrel grew hot, picking off enemy soldiers as they advanced across the open ground. That's when he saw it. A German tank, its massive gun trained directly at the hospital's main entrance. One shell would collapse the building, crushing everyone inside. His shadow suddenly stood up from the floor, pointing directly at the tank. James understood. This was the moment. This was why he had been protected, why he had been guided, why his shadow had learned to move independently, not to save his own life, but to save the lives of 200 helpless men who couldn't save themselves. James grabbed a bazooka from a fallen soldier and sprinted toward the stairs. His shadow ran beside him, but it was almost invisible now, using the last of its supernatural strength. On the ground floor, James kicked open a side door and ran into the open courtyard between the hospital and the advancing tank. The German tank crew saw him immediately. The machine gun on top of the tank swiveled toward James as he knelt and aimed the bazooka. He
He had one shot. If he missed, the tank would destroy the hospital and everyone inside. As James squeezed the trigger, something impossible happened. His shadow, now barely visible, reached out and seemed to steady his aim. The rocket launched with a whoosh of flame and smoke, streaking across the courtyard like a falling star in reverse. The tank exploded in a ball of fire that lit up the night sky. But the machine gun had found its mark. James felt the bullets tear through his chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the frozen ground. As his vision began to fade, he saw his shadow one last time. It wasn't his shadow anymore. It was Tommy's shadow, reaching across an ocean to hold his big brother's hand as the light began to fade. In Ohio, a little boy named Tommy suddenly sat up in his hospital bed and smiled. For the first time in weeks, he felt strong enough to get up and walk to the window. There, in the late afternoon sun, he saw two shadows on the wall, his own and his big brother's, standing side by side like they always would. James Morrison died saving 200 men, but his shadow lived on, protecting the little brother who had sent him to war with nothing but faith and love.
Part 6. Truth Revealed. The telegram arrived at the Morrison house on a Tuesday morning in March 1945. Mrs. Morrison had been expecting it for weeks, the way mothers do when they haven't heard from their sons in too long. Her hands trembled as she signed for it, knowing that Western Union telegrams during wartime carried only two kinds of news, and good news didn't require signatures. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, Private James Morrison, was killed in action in defense of Allied wounded in Belgium on March 15, 1945. He died heroically, saving the lives of over 200 soldiers. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. Mrs. Morrison sank into her kitchen chair, the telegram fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. But before the tears could come, before the grief could overwhelm her, she heard something that made her heart skip. Laughter. Tommy's laughter, coming from upstairs. For the first time in 2 months, her dying son was laughing. Mrs. Morrison climbed the stairs on unsteady legs and found Tommy sitting up in bed, stronger than he'd been since Christmas. His cheeks had color in them. His eyes were bright and alert. He was drawing another one of his pictures, the ones with two shadows. "Mama, look!" Tommy held up his drawing excitedly. "Jimmy came to visit me last night. He told me he couldn't stay, but that his shadow would always be with me. See, that's me, and that's Jimmy's shadow holding my hand." Mrs. Morrison studied the drawing through her tears. It showed a little boy in a hospital bed, but beside the bed stood not one shadow, but hundreds of them, soldiers' shadows, all standing guard around Tommy's bed like an army of protectors. "Tommy, sweetheart, I have something to tell you about Jimmy." "I know, Mama. He had to go be with all the other soldier shadows, but he's not really gone. None of them are really gone. They're all still protecting people." That afternoon, Dr. Henderson made his regular visit to check on Tommy. What he found defied every medical textbook he'd ever studied. Tommy's heart, which had been failing for months, was suddenly stronger than it had ever been. The irregular rhythm had smoothed out. The dangerous murmur had disappeared. "Mrs. Morrison, I don't understand this. It's like Tommy received a heart transplant, but that's impossible. His entire cardiac function has improved overnight." Tommy looked up from his drawing and smiled. "It's not impossible, Doctor. Jimmy gave me half of his heart when he went away. That's what big brothers do." Dr. Henderson left that day, shaking his head, muttering about miracles he couldn't explain. Mrs. Morrison never told him about the telegram. Some truths
clothes were too precious to share with people who needed medical proof for everything. 3 months later, Tommy was well enough to leave the hospital. As they walked out into the bright June sunshine, Tommy stopped and looked at their shadows on the sidewalk. Mrs. Morrison saw only two shadows, hers and Tommy's, but Tommy saw something different. "Look, Mama, Jimmy's still here, and so are all his friends." Mrs. Morrison looked again, and, for just a moment, in the corner of her eye, she could have sworn she saw them too. Dozens of shadows walking alongside them, soldiers who had given their lives protecting others, still standing guard over the people they loved. That evening, as Tommy played in the backyard for the first time in almost a year, Mrs. Morrison found James's final letter among his belongings. It had been returned to her along with his personal effects. She opened it with trembling fingers. "Dear Tommy, by the time you read this, I'll probably be somewhere I can't write letters anymore. But I want you to know something important. Remember when you asked if I was going to fight the bad guys? Well, I did. I fought them as hard as I could. But here's what I learned, little brother. The real fight isn't against the bad guys out here. The real fight is for the good guys back home. Every day I was over here, I was fighting to protect you and Mama and everyone in Millfield who deserves to live in a world without fear. I want you to know that you made me brave, Tommy. Every time I was scared, I thought about your eyes when you asked me to fight the bad guys. Every time I didn't know if I could keep going, I remembered that my little brother was counting on me. If something happens to me, I don't want you to be sad. I want you to remember that I kept my promise. I fought the bad guys, and even if I can't come home, part of me will always be with you, in your shadow, in your dreams, in the courage you'll have when you need it most. You're going to grow up to be a good man, Tommy. I can see it in you already. And when you do, when you have children of your own, you tell them about your Uncle Jimmy. You tell them that sometimes the people who love us never really leave. They just find new ways to stay close. Be strong, little brother. Be brave. Be kind. And remember that somewhere, in the place where heroes go when their work is done, I'll be watching over you. All my love, Jimmy. P.S. If you ever see your shadow doing something strange, something that doesn't quite match what you're doing, don't be scared. That's just me, making sure you're safe. Mrs. Morrison folded the letter carefully and looked out the window at Tommy playing in the yard. As she watched, Tommy was running in circles, but his shadow seemed to be running alongside him rather than behind him. Two shadows racing through the grass like brothers who had never been separated. Over the years that followed, Tommy Morrison grew up strong and healthy. He became a doctor, dedicating his life to healing others. He married a wonderful woman and had 3 children of his own. And sometimes, when his own children played in the yard, Mrs. Morrison swore she could see multiple shadows running with them, protecting them, watching over them. Tommy never forgot his brother's promise. He never forgot that love could transcend death, that sacrifice could create miracles, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe in something impossible. And late at night, when Tommy told his children bedtime stories about his Uncle Jimmy, the shadows on the wall would dance and move as if somewhere in the place where heroes rest, James Morrison was still keeping his promise to fight the bad guys and protect the people that mattered most. Because some bonds are stronger than death. Some promises echo through generations, and some shadows never fade. They just find new people to protect.
The end.